The Security Council will now begin its consideration of Item 2 of the agenda. I now give the floor to Ms. Kaula Mata.
Thank you, Madam President, in your honor, King of St. Vincent and Grenadines. It's an honor for me to address this council today. The Special Envoy is continuing a set of engagements. He's in fact today in Riyadh in support of the UN-facilitated political process. I'm pleased to be able to inform the Council that plans are being finalized for the fourth session of the Constitutional Committee Small Body to convene from 13 November to 4 December in Geneva. This was made possible by the engagement and agreement of the two Syrian co-chairs that align with the mandate, the terms of reference, and the core rules of procedure. The Constitutional Committee, small body, will continue in Session 4 to discuss the agenda of Session 3 on national foundations and principles. And in Session 5, we'll discuss constitutional principles, basic principles of the Constitution. The co-chairs further agreed on the dates for Session 4, COVID-19 situation permitting, and to hold Session 5 in January 2021. The COVID-19 challenges in Geneva are considerable right now, and the Special Envoy is very aware of that. We are very grateful to the Swiss authorities for all they've done and are doing to enable this meeting to move ahead in these extraordinary times. We will be ensuring that the strictest health and safety protocols are followed and appreciate that the co-chairs and Constitutional Committee members have fully committed to the measures that will be in place. We continue monitoring the evolution of the epidemiological situation in Geneva ahead of the meeting. We all know that the committee has not yet made the kind of progress we had hoped. But the committee commitments of the Syrian parties to the package of two meetings and with agreed agendas presents an important opportunity for committee members to engage in good faith in a business-like manner to move forward the political process. If these sessions can proceed in a substantive manner and in a spirit of compromise, we believe it would help to build trust and confidence and make some progress. We also look forward to engaging with the Syrian Women's Advisory Board to benefit from their insights and support for all aspects of the constitutional process. Madam President, a constitutional track on its own cannot resolve the crisis. And the Syrian-led committee's work needs to be accompanied by mutual and reinforcing steps by Syrians and international players on the range of issues contained in Resolution 2254. It's important to note that while falling short of the nationwide ceasefire called for by Resolution 2254, the fragile and relative calm that the Special Envoy has spoken of in recent months continues broadly to hold. That calm, however, continues to be ever more challenged, raising concerns. This month saw renewed elevated escalation in northwest Syria, with fresh airstrikes, mutual shelling, and ground clashes between the Syrian government and HTS and armed opposition groups. But we also continue to see Russian-Turkish cooperation in the effort to preserve calm and address terrorism. We also saw a spike in violence in the northeast around the perimeters of Operation Peace Spring areas, new levels of turbulence in southwest Syria, Israeli strikes, and ongoing ISIL activity in the desert, a reminder of the magnitude of the terrorist challenge still confronting Syria. On this, the International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women, let me stress the Council that Syrian women in recent consultations with us have emphasized that peace and security means ending all forms of violence. Syrian women continue to suffer from sexual and gender-based violence, which has been widely documented. Measures put in place to prevent the spread of COVID-19 have increased the prevalence of domestic violence, child marriage, and sexual harassment. Syrian women have at the same time been at the forefront of initiatives to respond to the crisis. Meanwhile, Syrian women, men, and children are suffering profound economic hardship. The Syrian currency is beginning to experience another depreciation, causing a further rise in prices and diminishing purchasing power. In recent months, bread and energy shortages have affected Syrian livelihoods to an unprecedented degree. And as winter looms, families continue to face difficulties in providing home heating, and farmers suffer from fuel shortages. COVID-19 remains a major challenge and has exacerbated vulnerabilities in all parts of the country. In this context, it is also paramount that any sanctions avoid aggravating the plea of Syrian civilians. A particular focus of the SE engagement remains the plea of detainees, abductees, and missing persons. Unfortunately, we have not seen the kind of progress we need on the release of the detained and abducted and information on the missing. We will continue on every occasion to press for this as a humanitarian imperative and as a vital step towards building confidence. Most urgent is the release at a scale of women, children, and the sick and elderly, and humanitarian access to places detention. The plea of millions of Syrian refugees and internally displaced persons continues to deteriorate. The United Nations supports Syrian refugees, whatever their choices, and seeks to engage all parties in the effort to enable safe, dignified, and well-informed and voluntary returns. Higher numbers are likely only be achieved once the factors that refugees say prevent them from returning to livelihoods, prevent them from returning are addressed, including personal security, access to livelihoods, basic services, and education, as well as restoration, rehabilitation, and post-conflict reconstruction of housing, land, and property. Action on these fronts would help create an enabling environment for such returns, something that is anchored in the tenets of Resolution 2254. Madam President, Resolution 2254 contains all the elements that are still commonly understood as required for a political solution. Respecting the sovereignty, unity, independence, and territorial integrity of Syria, a Syrian-led and owned political process that includes a constitutional process culminating in free, fair, and inclusive elections supervised by the United Nations, and that has the meaningful participation of women, a nationwide ceasefire, countering proscribed terrorist groups in compliance with international law, the protection of civilians, abductees, and information missing, implementing confidence-building measures, conditions for the safe and voluntary returns of refugees and internally displaced persons, and post-conflict reconstruction and rehabilitation. However, 5 years after the resolution, and with the Syrian people inside and outside Syria continuing to suffer deeply, the Special Envoy is taking stock of what has and has not been achieved in the implementation of this mandate. He is constantly and widely, he is consulting widely as he does so, and in the process seeking to identify new or additional ways to move the process forward. He began this talking when he met the now late Syrian Foreign Minister Moualem and in contacts with the opposition Syrian Negotiation Commission. He also met senior Turkish officials in Ankara, Egyptian Foreign Minister Shukri, and League of Arab States Secretary General Abul Ghaid in Cairo, and Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov, as well as other senior officials in Moscow. He met Iranian Foreign Minister Zarif and other senior officials recently in Tehran, and is today in Riyadh, where he is meeting Saudi Foreign Minister Prince Faisal bin Farhan Al Saud. During this period, the Special Envoy also engaged by telephone with Jordanian Foreign Minister Safadi and with other senior Arab, American, and European officials. He appreciates the counsel and insights of all and seeks their strengthened support for the political process. He will be continuing this engagement in the period ahead with the Syrian parties and international partners. In that process, he will also continue to consult Women's Advisory Board and seek the views and insights of a wide range of Syrian civil society interlocutors through ongoing consultations of the civil society support group. As that wider exploration continues and deepens, we focus in the meantime on facilitating the Constitutional Committee meeting in Geneva next week. We trust that all members of the committee will approach the two forthcoming sessions in a spirit of compromise and with a determination to engage seriously. They will have our full support in that regard. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank Ms. Matar for her briefing, and I now give the floor to Mr. Rajasingham.
Thank you, Madam President. I will focus today on 5 areas. First, the situation of displaced people across Syria as winter approaches. Second, the humanitarian impact of the economic crisis. Third, the protection of civilians. Fourth, humanitarian access. And fifth, assistance being provided by American organizations across Syria. Madam President, 6.7 million people in Syria are internally displaced. Our assessments show that a third of them, that means they live in damaged or unfinished buildings in public spaces like schools or in tents that don't provide sufficient protection from the elements. Winter is proving to be incredibly hard for those without adequate shelter, not to mention the very basics like fuel for heating, blankets, warm clothes, and shoes. We estimate that more than 3 million people across all of Syria need this type of assistance this winter season. Displaced families are particularly vulnerable, as are communities in elevated areas, such as parts of rural Damascus. Already, heavy rains are causing flooding in some areas. Hundreds of tents in displacement sites in Idlib and western Aleppo have been damaged or destroyed by floods over the past month. When sites like this flood, the water ruins or washes away what little belongings people have left. It muddies the ground, preventing water trucks and other assistance from getting through, and it causes sewage systems to overflow. As the weather gets colder over the coming weeks and with continued fuel shortages, we expect that people will, as they did last year, resort to burning anything they can find to try and keep themselves and their children warm, risking tent fires and poisoning from toxic fumes. Our colleagues are working hard to supply vulnerable families across Syria with what they need to get through the winter. And I would like to thank others for continuing to support this life-saving effort. Madam President, my second point is the economic crisis. The value of the Syrian pound on the informal market is not as volatile as it was over the summer, but it has declined steadily over the past month, as the Deputy Special Envoy Khawla Matar has also noted. It currently trades at around 2,900 to the dollar, US dollar, compared with around 2,300 in October. Prices of essentials are at historic levels. The price of subsidized bread, which the poorest and most vulnerable families rely on, doubled last month, while the weight of a bundle was reduced by 15%. The market price of bread increased by 26% between September and October. Diesel went up by 21%, and some fresh produce went up by 44%. The price of a national reference food basket increased by 247% since October last year, and is now higher than at any point since WFP started price monitoring in Syria in 2013. Madam President, what this means, quite simply, is that people are increasingly unable to feed their families. Today, an estimated 9.3 million people in Syria are food insecure. That's 1.4 million more people than a year ago and more than at any time during the crisis. About 1 million of them are severely food insecure, twice as many as last year, and we expect this number to increase. The protection of civilians is my next point, Madam President. Deputy Special Envoy Khawla Matai has already briefed you on the concerning rise in violence, including in the northwest. Since the ceasefire agreement in March, some 240,000 displaced people have returned to towns and villages in southern Idlib and western Aleppo. Some of these places are now, again, coming under attack. At least 8 civilians were reportedly killed, including children, and at least 15 others were injured as a result of shelling and airstrikes in the northwest this month. Among those killed were 2 aid workers on their way to a UNICEF-supported child-friendly space where children can play and rest. Over the past 2 months, at least 6 humanitarian workers have been killed and 6 others injured in northwest Syria. The risks our humanitarian colleagues are taking every day are simply unacceptable. Humanitarian workers must be able to deliver assistance without fear of attack. Across the country, civilians continue to be exposed to additional serious violations and abuses, including arbitrary detention, abduction, and extrajudicial execution. Reports continue of kidnappings and killings in the south. We are also seeing an alarming increase in the use of improvised explosive devices. Just yesterday, separate bombings in Al-Bab and Afrin killed 8 civilians and injured more than 30, according to preliminary reports. Explosive hazards are having a devastating impact. Our most recent data show an explosive incident recorded roughly every 10 minutes on average. The vast majority of victims, 85%, are boys and men. An explosive ordnance assessment in parts of eastern and western Ghouta has surveyed some 68 hectares since August and identified 63% of that as contaminated. 272 items of explosive ordnance have been located and marked. Survey and clearance are the only solution to the problem of landmines and explosive ordnance in Syria, but this work is not sufficiently funded. UNMAS requires another $18 million, of which $5 million is urgently needed to launch clearance operations in eastern and western Ghouta. Madam President, protecting the infrastructure that is indispensable to civilian survival is equally critical. In Aleppo's Al-Bab sub-district, an estimated 185,000 people continue to face water shortages as water supply from the Ain al-Baida pumping station remains cut off. Water from local wells is of poor quality and only covers around 15% of water needs in the area. Madam President, my next point is humanitarian access. All UN assistance bound for northern Aleppo that previously came to the Bab al-Salam border crossing point is now being rerouted through Bab al-Hawa. Roadworks continue on the main route into northern Aleppo and are scheduled for completion in the coming weeks before the weather makes such works impossible. A UN cross-border mission into Idlib last month saw firsthand the widespread and acute needs of people in this part of Syria. Cross-border assistance continues to respond to these needs. More than 2,000 trucks of UN aid have entered through Bab al-Hawa since July, when Security Council Resolution 2533 came into effect. Madam President, efforts continue to bridge gaps in medical assistance in northeast Syria. All 17 hospitals and 106 primary healthcare facilities in the northeast have been reached with medical supplies on at least one occasion through one or more delivery modalities. That includes those that previously depended on UN cross-border operations. However, it has been inconsistent access. Gaps continue to be reported and partners continue to explore all available means of addressing these. But let me be clear, Health services are extremely weak across the country and are being stretched to new extremes under the public health impact of COVID-19. Gaps in assistance and shortages of medical supplies and personnel are prevalent everywhere. In Daraa, in the south, the National Hospital had 30 doctors pre-crisis. Today, it has only 3, 1/10 of the previous number, with women giving birth in rooms with other patients due to a lack of beds. Turning to Al-Hol, we are monitoring with concern an increasing number of violent incidents in the camp. Ensuring the safety and security of residents is a priority, and the responsibility for this resides with the local authorities. Some 64,000 people remain in Al-Hol, more than half of whom are children under the age of 12. Many are unaccompanied, many are suffering high levels of psychological distress. Their situation must be urgently addressed. Turning to Rukban, an interagency mission visited the Al-Waha Transit Center early this month as part of ongoing efforts to facilitate departures for those wishing to leave. Meanwhile, the UN remains without access to the 12,000 people in Rukban. While efforts continue to support voluntary departures and to find sustainable arrangements for those who remain, humanitarian assistance must be allowed to get through. My final point, Madam President, is the assistance being provided by humanitarian agencies across Syria. So far this year, this has included the delivery of regular food assistance to 5.4 million people, emergency nutrition assistance to 1.5 million pregnant and lactating women and children under age 5, the delivery of essential non-food items such as blankets, plastic sheets, and water containers to almost 3 million people, cash transfers of US dollars 68 million to 1 million people, including 430,000 Palestinian refugees, the initiation of COVID-19 PCR testing capacity in 9 laboratories in 7 governorates, and the establishment of 34 COVID-19 treatment sites with 1,433 inpatient beds for moderate cases and 303 beds for critical cases. The Syria humanitarian operation collectively reaches an average of 7.4 million people with assistance each month. It is an enormous effort to stave off an even worse situation. This would be impossible without the extraordinary commitment and endurance of our frontline colleagues who are overwhelmingly Syrian and are themselves directly affected by the crisis. They are delivering aid under the most difficult of circumstances at great personal risk. They must be protected. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank Mr. Raja Singham for his briefing. I now give the floor to those council members who wish to make statements. I give the floor to the representative of Belgium.
Thank you, Madam President. This is probably the last time that Belgium will make a statement in this council on behalf of Germany and Belgium, the humanitarian COPAN holders. And we would like to thank ASG and Deputy Emergency Relief Coordinator Raja Singham for his briefing. We also extend our gratitude to all humanitarian and medical workers in Syria. They deserve our respect, assistance, and protection. Madam President, I will make 4 points. First, some claim that the security situation in Syria has stabilized. Indeed, the situation on the ground remains relatively calm compared to the deathly offensives we witnessed in 2019 and early 2020, which were characterized by deliberate attacks on hospitals and schools and led to the displacement of over 1 million civilians. However, serious protection concerns remain. In the northwest alone, 22 civilians, including 6 children, were killed as a result of shelling and airstrikes since we last met. And these numbers do not include yesterday's attack in Al-Bab and Afrin. During the last 2 months, 6 humanitarian workers lost their life due to the same reason. Therefore, Belgium and Germany together reiterate the importance of the effective implementation by all actors of the ceasefire agreement of March 2020. We also call for a national ceasefire monitored by the United Nations. As humanitarian coupon holders, we have recalled time and again throughout our membership of the Council that counterterrorism actions have to be in line with international humanitarian law and should not harm civilians or humanitarian workers or compromise the delivery of principled humanitarian aid. Secondly, Madam President, 11 million Syrians remain in need of humanitarian assistance and protection. The economic and health crisis have added additional burden to an already dire situation. The war, mismanagement, and corruption have resulted in an economic and currency crisis without precedent, continuously diminishing the purchasing power of Syrians across the country. 9.3 million people are currently food insecure, Mr. Rajasingham reminded to us. This food crisis has very tangible consequences for ordinary citizens, and even more so for the most vulnerable, children, persons with disabilities, and women and girls. In addition, COVID-19 continues to claim victims across the country. Testing capacity remains low, although since March, it has increased in some parts of the country, including in the Northwest. Capacity remains woefully inadequate in other parts of the country, however, and healthcare workers are paying a heavy price as they are in the front line in the fight against COVID-19. And we know the reason why the Syrian healthcare system is in such a precarious state. Health facilities were deliberately targeted and destroyed during the years of war in direct contravention of humanitarian law. I also listened carefully to what ASG Rajasingham said about water supply. Conflict parties are playing with the lives of innocent civilians. The ongoing problems, both in the Northwest and in the Northeast, are unacceptable in any given situation. It is even more so in times of a pandemic, when sanitation is crucial to fight the transmission of the virus. All parties should consider it a priority to durably restore access to water for all civilians. Thirdly, Madam President, Belgium and Germany want to draw the attention once again to humanitarian access. This is at the core of the humanitarian file. This humanitarian coupon holdership, as you know, has put infinite efforts into maximizing the humanitarian access for all civilians in need across the country, and fully in line with the humanitarian principles of humanity, neutrality, impartiality, and independence. Despite our indefatigable efforts, humanitarian access was severely restricted during the last 2 years, solely for political and military considerations in contravention of humanitarian principles and in defiance of the SG's and the USG's calls for more cross-border and cross-line access. After the closure of the crossing point of Yarubia, many health facilities suffer shortage of supply. Although cross-line access to those facilities has improved slightly, significant deficiencies remain. This is indefensible and immoral. In the absence of adequate cross-line aid deliveries, the closure of Yarubia should be reversed without further ado. Similarly, in the discussions leading to the closure of the crossing point of Bab al-Salam, the claim was made that those regions it serviced in the Northwest would be, from then on, supported through cross-line humanitarian aid via Bab al-Hawa. The said reality here too is that the closure of Bab al-Salam has thus far rendered humanitarian operations in the Northwest more costly and more risky. It is fair to say that here too, claims of adequate cross-line assistance to compensate for the forced decrease in cross-border assistance were incorrect, jeopardizing the delivery of sufficient humanitarian aid to all civilians for the cold and dark months ahead. Madam President, it is the task of this Council to act as a guarantor for international peace and security. It defies the logic how some member states in this Council have chosen to limit humanitarian access in times of tremendous need, rather than guaranteeing it, prioritizing their own narrative over the well-being of Syrian civilians, be they men, women, or children. And fourthly, Madam President, I would like to repeat that only a genuine political process in line with Resolution 2254 can break the cycle of violence. And only accountability can begin to address the suffering that so many Syrian children, women and men are still subject to on a daily basis. The humanitarian co-pen holders fully support the conclusions of the Board of Inquiry and the Board of the Triple IM and the work of the Triple IM and the COI, as well as justice initiatives on a national or international level. Refugees will only be able to return to live in their country of origin on a voluntary basis, and they will only do so if they feel they can do it safely, securely, and with dignity. Finally, Madam President, some deliberately misconstrue Western sanctions as the cause of the medical crisis in Syria. And they see fit to exploit the COVID-19 crisis to call for the easing of sanctions in a vain effort to deflect from both the detrimental restrictions on cross-border humanitarian aid and the nefarious and well-documented targeting of health facilities by the Syrian authorities. So, for the sake of fact-based debate, allow me to reiterate clearly that the European Union sanctions neither impede humanitarian assistance nor medical supplies. Quite on the contrary, Germany, Belgium, and their European partners are the foremost humanitarian donors to the Syrian people. I thank you for your attention.
I thank the representative of Belgium for his statement. I give the floor to the representative of Germany.
Madam President, thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed to Acting ASG Raja Singham for his sobering account. I should also like to thank Deputy Special Envoy Matar for her briefing, and thank you very much to you, Kuala, and to Special Envoy Peterson for your tireless efforts. These efforts are tireless. Yes, at some point we still believe that they have been largely futile. This is not your fault. The Constitutional Committee has not produced any real progress to date, and this, we believe, is due to the persistent and systematic obstruction by the Syrian regime. The aim of the regime is clear. It wants to delay and obstruct the Constitutional Committee until the presidential elections in 2021. We must not and we will not let them get away with this. The international community will not be fooled. It will not recognize the results of elections which are not free and fair and which are not conducted pursuant to a new constitution under the supervision of the United Nations and with the participation of all Syrians, including the diaspora. Dear Kuala, we have taken note of the agreement on the dates and the agenda of a fourth and fifth round of the Constitutional Committee. These meetings must, at long last, discuss substantial issues in order to achieve meaningful progress towards drafting a new constitution. We call on the Syrian regime to finally engage seriously and constructively in the Constitutional Committee, and we call on Russia to use its influence on Damascus in this regard. The political process under the auspices of the United Nations, in line with Resolution 2254 and the Geneva Communique of 2012, is the only sustainable way out of the Syrian catastrophe. Pretending that the conflict in Syria is over and that the situation is moving towards peace and normalization is frankly absurd. This is why the recent conference on refugee returns was, in our view, a cynical propaganda stunt. It is outrageous to claim that an alleged intimidation by Western countries, sanctions against the regime, or lack of reconstruction assistance would hinder the return of Syrian refugees. Let's look at the facts on the ground that Ramesh has just reported to us, and it immediately becomes clear it is the Syrian regime's war against its own people, abetted by its allies, Iran and Russia, and its system of brutal oppression, together with a serious threat of indiscriminate detention, forced disappearance, torture, and physical and sexual violence, which are the main reasons why millions of Syrians have fled their country. They are also the biggest obstacles for a safe, voluntary, dignified, and sustainable return of refugees and internally displaced persons to their areas of origin in Syria, in line with international law and the UNHCR protection thresholds and parameters for refugee return to Syria. Let me reaffirm, there will be no lifting of EU sanctions unless the Syrian regime changes its brutal behavior and ends its grave violations of international human rights law and international humanitarian law. In this context, I fully subscribe to the observations that Philippe has just made regarding EU sanctions, and I'm quite willing to re-enter our discussion should that point be made by other delegations. Let me also make clear that Germany and the European Union will only assist in the reconstruction of Syria once a comprehensive, genuine, and inclusive political transition in line with Resolution 2254 is firmly underway. All elements of Resolution 2254 need to be fully implemented. In addition to a complete nationwide ceasefire without delay, we need to see the immediate release of all arbitrarily detained persons, particularly women and children. We deeply regret that there has been no meaningful action on the fate of detainees and missing persons, which would be so important for building confidence and trust among the Syrian parties. Germany continues to be convinced that this Council should express a unified position and request all parties, in particular the Syrian regime, which holds the overwhelming majority of detainees, to immediately release all arbitrarily detained persons, starting with the most vulnerable. This Council should also call upon all parties, in particular the Syrian regime, to allow immediate, unconditional, and unhindered access for relevant humanitarian organizations to all prisoners and detention facilities. And the Council should urge all parties, in particular the Syrian regime, to inform the families of the fate and the whereabouts of the tens of thousands of missing and disappeared persons. Finally, this Council must live up to its responsibility. It must join the fight against impunity and ensure that those responsible for torture and killing in Syrian prisons and for other crimes and atrocities are held accountable. The evidence for serious violations of international humanitarian law, various reports have been well documented in various reports, but also in the Caesar photos. These photos have been introduced as evidence in the trial against two former Syrian intelligence officers before a German court in Koblenz. We must not tolerate impunity for the most serious crimes in Syria. Whoever commits crimes against humanity or war crimes must feel that he is not safe anywhere and will be held accountable. Without this, reconciliation and sustainable peace in Syria will not be possible. On the humanitarian situation, Madam President, I would like to add a few words in my national capacity. Our support for the Syrian people will continue. Winter is coming. Germany will therefore allocate another $24 million to the Syria Cross-Border Humanitarian Fund these days. In 2019, Germany pledged and allocated more than $1.6 billion in support of people in need inside Syria and refugees in host countries in the region. Since 2012, Germany has given more than $10 billion. And let's not forget that more than 700,000 Syrian refugees live in Germany. Our approach in this is purely humanitarian because we truly care about the people of Syria and we will continue to do so. Thank you very much.
I thank the representative of Germany for his statement. I give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Благодарю вас, госпожа председатель. Мы признательны Хаули Матар и Рамешу Раджисанхаму за сегодняшний брифинг и рады видеть госпожу Матар в добром здравии. Посол Джафари, мы хотели бы в вашем лице выразить семье и близким народу и правительству Сирии искренние соболезнования в связи с кончиной министра иностранных дел Сирийской Арабской Республики Валида Муалима. Мы помним его и запомним как мудрого и принципиального дипломата, эффективно выполнявшего возложенные на него внешнеполитические задачи в непростые для Сирии годы, а также внесшего существенный вклад в развитие двусторонних российско-сирийских отношений. Госпожа председатель, мы приветствуем согласование сирийскими делегациями в Конституционном комитете повестки дня и графика предстоящих заседаний редакционной комиссии этого органа. Рассчитываем, что он продолжит работать в стабильном режиме в этом и следующем году. К сожалению, приходится учитывать фактор коронавируса и соответствующих ограничений, так как важно обеспечить здоровье и безопасность всех сирийских делегатов команды Гейра Педерсона и принимающей швейцарской стороны. Надеемся, что пандемия не помешает планам сирийцев. Будем и далее поддерживать посреднические усилия спецпосланника. Весьма полезными были его переговоры в Москве 19-20 ноября. Другой важный элемент – недопущение внешнего вмешательства, ведомый самими сирийцами процесс. У работы Конституционного комитета нет навязанных временных ограничений. Видим задачу международного сообщества в создании вокруг Конституционного комитета конструктивной атмосферы. Обстановка на подконтрольных правительству Сирии территориях в целом спокойная. Сирийская армия дает отпор атакам спящих ячеек террористов. Очагом нестабильности остается Идлиб, в котором копались террористы Хият и Рашан. Несмотря на остановку боевых действий, они продолжают провокации, обстреливают позиции армии и населенные пункты. Происходят столкновения между различными группировками. В самом Идлибе сохраняется практика притеснения мирных граждан, казней и атак на гуманитарных работников. Контртеррористические усилия будут продолжены, несмотря на попытки западных представителей защитить боевиков призывами о заключении с ними режима прекращения огня. Ребрендинг террористов мы не допустим, хотя достоянием гласности стала информация о масштабном финансировании некоторыми западными государствами медийных кампаний сторонников силового свержения законного правительства Сирии. Мы все видели эти страшные и бесчеловечные ролики, снятые, очевидно, деньги внешних спонсоров. Крайнюю озабоченность вызывают процессы, идущие на территориях, где сохраняется незаконное военное присутствие США. Помимо провоцируемых внешней оккупацией тенденций на сепаратизм, разрыв исторических связей между различными этноконфессиональными группами Сирии, блокируются и усилия по восстановлению территориальной целостности страны. Западные коллеги, которые на словах так рьяно радеют за права человека, но только тогда, когда это им выгодно, старательно отводят глаза от положения в этой части Сирии, равно как и в Идлибе. В то же время поступают сообщения об освобождении из тюрем боевиков, которые направляются под контрольные Дамаску районы, о планируемых судебных процессах, в том числе над иностранными гражданами, непонятно какими судами. Замалчиваются случаи притеснения арабского населения, продолжается разграбление нефтеносных месторождений и загрязнение окружающей среды, о чем, к сожалению, молчит Организация Объединенных Наций. Со своей стороны последовательно выступаем за сохранение единства Сирии, уважение ее суверенитета и территориальной целостности, призываем отказаться от планов по разделению страны и затягиванию конфликта в ней. Это касается как Востока, так и Запада САР, в том числе оккупированных сирийских Голланд, визит на который высокопоставленных чиновников Соединенных Штатов рассматриваем как провокацию. Госпожа председатель, отмечаем устойчивость поставок гумпомощи ООН через трансграничный механизм на северо-запад Сирии. Убеждены, что у гуманитарщиков имеется весь потенциал для подготовки к зимнему периоду. Не можем обойти стороной уже набивший всем оскомину вопрос о гуманитарном конвое через линии соприкосновения в населенные пункты Атареб и Дар-эт-Изза на северо-западе Сирии. Нам с апреля рассказывают про отсутствие договоренностей со всеми заинтересованными сторонами на организацию этого конвоя изнутри Сирии. Удивительно, что мы не слышим комментариев наших коллег о недоговороспособности этих сторон, о нарушении ими гуманитарных принципов, хотя в адрес Дамаска, который как раз увеличивает разрешение на проход гумконвоя в различные районы, такая критика сыпется постоянно. Мы сегодня вновь уже слышали и наверняка услышим еще о гуманности, о чрезвычайной гуманности санкций, которые ввел Евросоюз, Соединенные Штаты и некоторые другие страны против сирийского народа. Мы недавно ознакомились с новым изданием Guidance Note on the Provision of Humanitarian Aid to Fight the COVID-19 Pandemic in Certain Environments Subject to EU Restrictive Measures. Они касались на этот раз Венесуэлы, Никарагуа.
This was Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Iran. And if you are to read that document carefully, you'll see that humanitarian things just don't exist there. So when we talk about Syria, true humanitarian assistance needs to be provided despite external pressure and ongoing tightening, despite the coronavirus pandemic, of unlawful unilateral sanctions that hit ordinary people hard. The Syrian Arab Republic government is making efforts for post-conflict settlement. One challenge is to rebuild housing and infrastructure for Syrian refugees who, whether our Western colleagues like it or not, are returning home on a daily basis. On the 11th and 12th of November in Damascus, there was the International Conference on the Return of Refugees. Participants in the conference were from more than 20 states and international organizations. Russia assisted the Syrians in organizing this event and actively participated in it. Unfortunately, the UN was represented just as an observer. This significantly limited the organization's ability to participate directly in the work of the conference. The UN was an observer. We trust the UN will actively participate in this solely humanitarian process without paying heed to political machinations from a number of states. These machinations from Western colleagues, first and foremost the US, who themselves boycotted the event and urged other states to do the same, speak for themselves. Once again, there was evidence of double standards regarding Syria, its people, and the so-called baddies in the view of the West, the baddie Syrians who don't want to overthrow the government, but rather want just to live in their own country. Thus, specific efforts were made to disrupt the implementation. The interpreter is getting a lot of interference on the line, unfortunately, which is something that everybody is really urging. Thus, specific efforts were made to disrupt the implementation of Security Council Resolution 2254, which clearly stipulates the need for refugees to return. That resolution clearly stipulates the need for the return to the Syrian Arab Republic of refugees. We hasten to disappoint our colleagues. The conference proved its worth in that area and gave an impetus to a systematic, targeted process. There are ongoing efforts to return to Russia the children of Russian citizens from Syria. On the 13th of November, 27 more Russian children were returned home. In total, from 2017, from Syria, 133 minors who are citizens of the Russian Federation were returned home. Given the plans for the administration of the Northeast to disband the alcohol camp, we draw the attention of our colleagues to the pressing need for them to be involved in the repatriation of their citizens. At the same time, there's a need to pay careful attention to the current very serious humanitarian situation in that camp. We would also recall the US's responsibility as the occupying force, responsibility for what is going on in the Rukban camp. Madam President, we welcome the decision to hold a joint meeting of the UN Security Council on the political and humanitarian situation in Syria in order to optimize the timetable for the work of the Security Council. And because of the need to assess the situation in the country comprehensively, we trust that this practice will be further bolstered. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for his statement. I give the floor to the representative of the Dominican Republic.
Thank you very much, Madam President. We thank Mr. Raja Singham, Acting Assistant Secretary General, and Ms. Mata, Deputy Special Envoy of the Secretary General, for being with us today and for their reports. And we recognize their enormous efforts within their respective mandates to secure genuine peace in Syria, which once and for all will make it possible for this thriving and resilient nation to be reborn. Today, we are hopeful in hearing that the co-chairs of the Constitutional Committee have agreed on the points for the holding of the 4th and 5th working meetings to begin next week and to continue in January 2021. We congratulate the Special Envoy and everyone who was involved in achieving this important step, and we call on the parties taking part in these discussions to do so with the greatest possible level of commitment and constructive spirit. This shows us once again that everyone's involvement is required for sustainable peace in Syria in order to alleviate the suffering of the people there. President, to begin, we'd like to express our concern at the increase of violence and insecurity in the northwest of the country. An increase in attacks which have cost the lives of hundreds of civilians, including children, is unacceptable. Moreover, it poses serious challenges to the protection of the civilian population, the vast majority of which, as winter is approaching, find themselves in situations of displacement in deplorable conditions. There needs to be a minimum level of preparation so that the country can deal with the current pandemic. We extend our most heartfelt condolences to the families of the thousands of healthcare workers, Syrian healthcare workers, who have lost their lives as a result of coronavirus and in many cases due to a lack of necessary protection. President, it is with an equally heavy heart that we would like to touch on the rampant food insecurity situation in the country. With this critical economic situation, Syrian families increasingly have no access to goods and services, basic goods and services. In addition to this, there is a fuel supply crisis, leading to a truly unbearable situation to which no human being should be subjected. Once again, we join in the appeals expressed by many here and by humanitarian organizations on the ground that Humanitarian access in Syria must be provided on a consistent basis to all Syrians in need, regardless of where they live, on the basis of neutrality, impartiality, and independence. We call for the current modalities for the provision of assistance to be reviewed because we wonder if they are truly sufficient. The Dominican Republic calls for an urgent solution to the existing gaps in the provision of assistance, in particular medical assistance in the northeast of the country, as Ramesh pointed out. Madam President, we reiterate that there is no military solution to the conflict in Syria. Only through agreement and political dialogue will it be possible to meet the aspirations of the population within and outside the country. We must continue to work towards the full implementation of Resolution 2254 as the roadmap for political transformation and as a precondition for the voluntary and dignified return of millions of displaced Syrians and refugees worldwide. In conclusion, I'd like to remind everyone that as today is the International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women, the Dominican Republic takes this opportunity to express its complete rejection of acts of violence against the civilian population, including women, and we make an urgent appeal for the existing ceasefire agreements to be observed. There will be no progress in the midst of violence. There is no future without peace. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the Dominican Republic for his statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Tunisia.
Thank you, Madam President. I'd like to thank Deputy Special Envoy of the Secretary General for Syria, Madam Khawla Batar, as well as Acting Assistant Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs, Mr. Ramesh Rajasingham. We thank them both for their briefings. The delegation of Tunisia welcomes the political developments that Ms. Batar has briefed us on with regard to achieving a breakthrough in the political efforts and in setting the dates for the fourth and the fifth rounds of the talks for the Syrian Constitutional Committee, which will happen later this year and early next year. We would also like to urge the different Syrian parts to put ahead the interest of the Syrian people by exercising flexibility and searching for common denominators and actively and constructively engaging without any preconditions. We also encourage them to put a clear work plan that would guarantee the continued consultations and engagement in the Constitutional Committee. Here, Tunisia would like to renew its position that states that there is no alternative to a political solution in order to treat and deal with the deep roots of this crisis and put an end to the suffering of the Syrian people, based on Security Council Resolution 2254 and in a manner that would preserve Syria's unity, its sovereignty, and its territorial integrity, and in a way that would put an end to foreign intervention and the presence of terrorist groups in Syria and would return peace and stability to Syria and the region. We stress the need for the committee's work to be accompanied by measures to build confidence and to push forward the expanded political track in order to achieve free and credible elections under the supervision of the United Nations in accordance with Security Council Resolution 2254 and in a manner that meets the legitimate aspirations of the Syrian people. Madam President, the current reality of the Syrian people causes extreme concern amongst us as the COVID-19 pandemic continues and as we witness the weak capacities of the Syrian healthcare system to deal with this pandemic. Not to mention the deteriorated food and water security situation as a result of the vulnerable economic and security conditions in the country and the effects of COVID-19. Moreover, it is important to deal with all these points of vulnerability and the causes of instability in order to avoid the current loopholes and gaps and to avoid any worst-case scenarios of this humanitarian crisis. And here we would like to stress the importance of the following arrangements. The primary priority is to guarantee a sustained ceasefire throughout Syria. Despite the relative decrease in aggressive actions over the past few months, we still face a vulnerable situation in view of a return of violence that would threaten the current efforts that are being made. Moreover, we call on all parties to abide by self-restraint and by international law and international humanitarian law and international human rights law and to work on guaranteeing the security of civilians as well as civilian installations and the protection of those working in the medical and humanitarian field. We stress the need to continue combating terrorism in an organized and collective manner and in accordance with international law so that the terrorist organizations listed on Security Council list are eliminated, and because they continue to pose a serious threat to Syria and the region at large, despite the success that has been achieved in targeting the leaders of these terrorist organizations. Second, we need to enhance humanitarian access. We express our support to OCHA's efforts to coordinate humanitarian aid in Syria. Moreover, we stress the importance of providing primary aid and to raise the state of preparedness as well as prevention as winter approaches in order to meet with the increasing medical and humanitarian needs and to effectively combat COVID using the different paths available, including giving access and aid through the lines of conflict and across the borders. We stress the need for all parties to cooperate in order to guarantee safe, sustained, and unimpeded humanitarian access in accordance with the rules of international humanitarian law and international law. And here we call on all parties to facilitate the work of humanitarian aid organizations in guaranteeing access across the lines of conflict and including giving access to the Syrian Arab Red Cross in a manner that would take into consideration the concept of Syria's sovereignty and would guarantee the return of the country's control and sovereignty over throughout its territories. Moreover, we need to improve the living conditions of Syrians, including their food and health and educational conditions in a more sustainable manner and in a manner that would enhance efforts for recovery and resilience and in a manner that would also guarantee a better standard of living to the vulnerable groups. The United Nations operations and the work of its special agencies in Syria, especially in terms of contracting of hospitals and schools and roads and water and power supplies and sanitation lines, all of this acquires extreme importance in that it raises the effectiveness and comprehensive nature of the necessary humanitarian response and guarantees the supreme interests of the vulnerable groups and offers protection to upcoming generations. Thank you, Madam President.
The representative is for his statement. I give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Madam President. And thank you to the Deputy Special Envoy and the Acting Assistant Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs for your briefings. The Assad regime and its allies, including permanent members of this council, would greatly prefer that the world ignore your briefings, pretend that Resolution 2254 is obsolete, believe now that political and humanitarian conditions in Syria are stabilizing, and that the conflict is over. Sadly, the realities cannot be obscured and must not be ignored. Lasting peace will only come when the Assad regime and its backers, including Russia, China, and Iran, accept a UN-brokered political settlement to the conflict in line with Resolution 2254. When the Assad regime shelling and Russian warplanes no longer destroy Syrian communities, families, and futures. when Iranian support for terrorist forces in Syria ceases, and when Chinese and Russian obstruction on this council finally comes to an end, and humanitarian assistance can reach every last one of the 11 million Syrian women and children and men in need. This preposterous refugee conference, hosted earlier this month in Damascus, is a prime example of how Russia and the Assad regime continue their attempts to perpetuate a false narrative about the situation in Syria. Russia and the regime have repeatedly and spectacularly failed to convince the international community, including those countries generous enough to take in large numbers of Syrian refugees, that Syria is ready for large refugee returns and that the regime genuinely wants them to return. Rather than end their depraved military campaign, enact political reforms, and further a political process to create an environment conducive to voluntary, safe, dignified, and informed returns, Russia and the regime are using refugees as a public relations tool. To add insult to injury, Russia has the audacity to ask the international community to provide the Assad regime with reconstruction funding after the brutal leader plunged the country into civil war and continues to kill his own people. The United States does not oppose the idea, in principle, of a conference centered on Syrian refugees to take stock of actions needed to ensure Syria's 6.6 million refugees can return safely for those who choose to do so. A legitimate conference on refugee returns can only be successful if coordinated with the United Nations, the United States, and other relevant countries, hosted by the UNHCR and held in a neutral location, not Damascus. Such a conference certainly would affirm that Syrians should not be pressed to return to their country until it is safe to do so, and that those living outside Syria should be able to participate in free and fair elections. As long as the Assad regime effectively ignores or undermines every aspect of Resolution 2254, Syrians will not be able to return safely. The United States welcomes the Special Envoy's plans for the fourth round of the Constitutional Committee later this month. This latest round is long overdue, and we urge the committee members, in particular the regime and Syrian opposition co-chairs, to make immediate substantive progress. Furthermore, we encourage Special Envoy Patterson to take any measures he thinks appropriate to facilitate the party's efforts consistent with the UN's parameters and principles, and identify this to this council any participants who continue to obstruct progress. Beyond the work of the Constitutional Committee, we ask the UN to facilitate and the parties to undertake confidence-building measures. These should include the unilateral release of arbitrarily held detainees, as called for in Resolution 2254, and the provision of information on the whereabouts of more than 100,000 Syrians who remain missing, including women and children. Turning to the humanitarian situation, it is abhorrent that humanitarian workers continue to face threats as they endeavor to deliver life-saving aid to the Syrian people. We offer our condolences to the families of 2 aid workers killed in northwest Syria earlier this month as they were on their way to work in a child-friendly space run by UNICEF. UN humanitarian operations, including cross-border operations, remain essential for the more than 11 million Syrians. The loss of 3 cross-border operation access points in the last 10 months has only worsened the suffering and the vulnerability of the Syrian people, and there are increasing reports of shortages at hospitals and medical facilities and delays in food delivery. We call the Council's attention to the resolution on the situation of human rights in Syria that passed overwhelmingly in the UN Third Committee last week. The resolution, which was co-sponsored by the United States, highlights the regime's egregious denial of humanitarian aid and urges the Council to reauthorize the opening of previous crossing points or open new ones to ensure aid gets into Syria through the most direct routes. We are closely monitoring the recent spike in violence in Syria's northwest. The Assad regime, Russia, and Iran must ensure the nationwide ceasefire the Secretary General and the Special Envoy have called for throughout this year is implemented, and no military offensive should resume anywhere in Syria. Winter is approaching, and we urge all Council members and UN member states to support efforts to quickly scale up assistance efforts to meet the growing needs of the 4.2 million Syrians in Idlib. Last year, the world was rightly horrified by reports of children freezing to death. We must not allow this to happen again. In addition to these needs, the Syrian people also face another long winter compounded by COVID-19. We are increasingly alarmed by reports of hospital ICU beds for COVID-19 patients already filled to capacity in northwest Syria, straining the region's already fragile health system. According to the official numbers, cases have risen by 250% since September. Sadly, we know that the official numbers are only the tip of the iceberg of Syria's COVID-19 crisis. The actual rates of infection are much higher than what is reported, yet the limited ability to test and trace makes it impossible to know the full extent of the virus's spread. The Syrian people face the same risk from COVID-19 as all of the rest of us, yet the shortages of medical supplies and the lack of testing raise concerns that the virus can spread unchecked and inflict damages on already vulnerable populations. Every month, this council meets on the crisis in Syria, and every month, the briefings reveal worsening human suffering. The United States once again calls on the Assad regime's supporters and abettors to alter the course and join us in pushing for full implementation of Resolution 2254. That is the only path that leads to peace and security in Syria and a more hopeful future for the Syrian people. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of the United States for her statement. I give the floor to the representative of China.
Madam President, I thank Special Envoy Ms. Mata and Acting ASG Raja Singham for their briefings. I would also like to mourn the sad passing of Mr. Mualem, Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Foreign Affairs of Syria, and express my sincere condolences to his family. Mr. Mualem was a seasoned statesman in Syria and made positive contribution to the relations between China and Syria. Madam President, the Syrian crisis has lasted almost 10 years. Its early settlement is the shared aspiration of the Syrian people and serves the common interests of the countries in the region as well as the international community at large. In our view, the international community must coordinate its efforts in political, economic, security and other sectors and take comprehensive measures to promote peace, stability and development in Syria. First, political settlement must be adhered to. China remains committed to a Syrian-led and Syrian-owned political process. The future of Syria must be determined by its people independently. I call upon all parties in Syria to narrow their differences through dialogue and consultations, advance the substantive work of the Constitutional Committee, and hold next round of talks when conditions permit. The work of the Constitutional Committee must be independent and free of external interference. The sovereignty and territorial integrity of Syria must be safeguarded. China commends Special Envoy Pedersen for his frequent visits to and good offices in the region recently. We also encourage the Astana process and the relevant countries to play an active role. Second, terrorism in Syria must be eradicated. Terrorists in Idlib have launched numerous attacks recently, kidnapping, detaining, and even executing civilians, journalists, health workers, and humanitarian workers. Such acts have seriously undermined the overall calm situation in the northwest part and posed a threat to the security and stability in Syria and the Middle East at large, causing concerns from the region and the international community. By no means can ceasefire arrangements be interpreted as a laissez-faire attitude towards terrorism. In line with the international community and the Security Council resolutions, the international community must strengthen counter-terrorism cooperation, adopt a unified standard, and vigorously combat terrorism in Syria with a view to creating a sound security environment for the political process in Syria. Third, economic and humanitarian situation in Syria must be improved in an all-round way. The Syrian government has been actively developing its economy, creating job opportunities, and promoting reconstruction. Such efforts shall be recognized. The international community must scale up its assistance to support Syria in its efforts to rebuild key infrastructure, provide basic living conditions, and fight against COVID-19. Such work will facilitate the return of Syrian refugees. China supports the UN cross-border and cross-line humanitarian relief work. In so doing, the role of the Syrian government must be fully leveraged. Through bilateral and multilateral channels, we have provided Syria with assistance worth $130 million and will continue to do our best to help the Syrian people. Fourth, unilateral coercive measures against Syria must be lifted. COVID-19 pandemic in Syria is worrisome. The country is short of resources to combat the pandemic, while the total number of confirmed cases is rising sharply. UCMs severely undermine Syria's capacity in mobilizing resources to combat the pandemic and recover its economy. On many occasions, Secretary General Guterres and Special Envoy Pedersen have called for lifting of sanctions against Syria. China strongly urges the United States and the countries concerned to effectively respond to this appeal and lift immediately UCMs against Syria and other countries. This afternoon, China, Niger, the Russian Federation, South Africa, and St. Vincent and the Grenadines will jointly hold an area formula meeting on unilateral coercive measures. Council members are welcome to attend. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of China for his statement. I give the floor to the representative of South Africa.
Thank you, Madam President. I thank Ms. Carla Mata, Deputy Special Envoy, and Mr. Ramesh Rajasingham, Acting Under Secretary General and Deputy Emergency Relief Coordinator, for their briefings on political and the situation in Syria. I also would like to welcome to our colleagues, Permanent Representative of Islamic Republic of Iran, the Syria Arab Republic, and Turkey, today's meeting. Madam President, I'll be addressing three elements in my statement today, namely political, security, and current situation in Syria. Firstly, on the political situation, Madam President, South Africa welcomes the recent package of agreements agreed to by the co-chairs of the Constitutional Committee on the agenda and dates of the upcoming meetings. The progress made in agreeing on an agenda of the national principles during the fourth round of talks, starting on the 30th of November, and on constitutional issues in the fifth round of negotiations is commended. We hope that this spirit of cooperation continues during these important discussions. South Africa calls on the parties to build on this momentum and engagement in a constructive manner to further political process. Real and tangible progress in the Constitutional Committee, as well as with regard to cessation in hostilities, requires the withdrawal of all external interference, including in terms of the support provided to armed groups. The sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of Syria must be respected and is non-negotiable. Madam President, the second element which I would like to address is the security situation in Syria. Let me start by expressing our deep concern at the continuing violence that has seen an increase in ceasefire violations and hostilities in the northwest of Syria. This has led to death and injury of a number of civilians, including humanitarian workers. On the 4th of November, Reports of the death of 8 civilians, including 2 aid workers, due to a number of airstrikes in southern Idlib, are truly alarming. I would like to take this opportunity to commend the dedication and strength of all humanitarian workers who continue to deliver essential services in the face of these challenges. The use of IEDs, landmines, and unexploded ordnance, in addition to the increasing reports of airstrikes and shelling, all contributed to the growing number of civilian deaths and injuries. When will enough be enough? South Africa urges the parties to fully adhere to the Idlib ceasefire agreement and to refrain from any actions that may escalate tensions even further. In this regard, South Africa fully supports Special Envoy Pedersen's call for a complete and immediate ceasefire nationwide, in line with Secretary General call for a global ceasefire in the face of the going global pandemic. We highly appreciate in this.
Excuse me, Ambassador. Excuse me. Pardon the interruption. We're getting interference. If you could ensure that the Interprify device is turned down or moved away from your primary device, we would appreciate that. Thank you.
We appreciate in this regard the cooperation between Syria, between Russia and Turkey in ensuring relative calm in Northwest. And we hope the two countries will continue exerting their efforts to ensure this relative stability in that part of Syria. Madam President, the third and last element which I would like to address is the humanitarian situation in Syria. The severe economic difficulties compounded by the continuing hostilities, the increasing spread of COVID-19 virus, and the onset of harsh winter conditions have created a unique set of circumstances that have contributed to the humanitarian situation in Syria. It is of great concern that the number of positive COVID-19 cases have more than doubled in the last month. South Africa reiterates its position that all those who require humanitarian assistance should be prevalent with it, no matter who and where they are. And as we have heard here today, in previous briefings, millions of Syrians are in need. In this regard, Madam President, the safe and unimpeded impartial delivery of humanitarian aid and support in line with international humanitarian law is more important than ever before. This includes using all available methods of aid delivery, including cross-border and cross-line assistance. We call on the government of Syria to continue to strengthen its cooperation with the UN and its partners towards the improvement and enhancement of cross-line humanitarian deliveries, particularly in areas where cross-border assistance may be limited. Without this crucial assistance, the Syrian people will continue to face growing food insecurity and the long-term effects of malnutrition, particularly with the harsh condition of winter setting in. Syria once again requests Secretary General and OCHA in their report to the Council to include the effects and impact of both direct and indirect unilateral sanctions on the humanitarian situation in Syria. Many Council members have previously stated that it is the Syrian civilians who are bearing the heaviest impact of the humanitarian situation. Surely, this should not be worsened by the additional weight of unilateral economic measures. Madam President, an important aspect in making progress on the political process is the need for confidence-building measures, including the release of civilians, particularly women and children, the elderly, and those disabilities from detention. We, Council members, could assist greatly if you repatriate all our national detained in Syria due to terrorist activities, including the women and children. These steps can assist in building trust and encourage the compromises that are necessary in any political negotiations. As you have said many times before, Madam President, the situation in Syria can only be resolved through dialogue and negotiations in the full implementation of Resolution 2254 of 2015. I would like to take this opportunity to welcome the combined briefings on the political and military situation in Syria. Discussing these two important aspects of the Syrian conflict together provides a comprehensive view of the situation on the ground in Syria and offer Council members an opportunity to be briefed on and discuss holistic options to make progress towards a peaceful, stable, and prosperous Syria. South Africa urges Syrian parties to return to Geneva with open mind, negotiate, make necessary compromises, and resolve to find a lasting, inclusive solution to end the conflict and begin to rebuild your devastated motherland. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of South Africa for his statement. I give the floor to the representative of France.
Madam President, I thank Ms. Mattar and Mr. Rajasingham for their statements. I would like to begin by commending the efforts of the Special Envoy in a particularly difficult context. France has taken careful note of the announcement of an agreement being reached on the agenda for the two upcoming meetings of the Constitutional Committee. This agreement was long awaited, and we hope that it will be fully respected. Yet, more than a year after its establishment, it is high time for the Constitutional Committee to finally move forward to constitutional reform. However, we regrettably are seeing the regime refuse to participate in the political process in good faith. It is clear that it is attempting to cast doubt on the mandate of the committee, which it itself approved. We therefore ask the United Nations to keep this council informed of any potential new roadblocks and identify those responsible. The absence of progress on the political front is dismaying in the face of the ongoing deterioration of the security and humanitarian situation. France is worried by the ongoing hostilities in the northwest of the country, as well as increasing instability in the south and the entrenchment of Daesh in the Badia. Civilian populations continue to pay the price for this. There's an urgent need to respond to the Secretary General's and his Special Envoy's appeal to implement a lasting cessation of hostilities in line with Resolutions 2532 and 2254. We call on all parties, in particular the Syrian regime, to comply with their obligations under international humanitarian law. The protection of civilians, including humanitarian and medical personnel, must remain the #1 priority. The humanitarian situation continues to worsen. The number of COVID-19 cases has more than doubled in just 1 month. And we all know that that figure is much lower than the real number of cases. Food insecurity is getting worse day by day. More than 2 million people do not have adequate shelter and are preparing to face another harsh winter in inhumane conditions. The increase in needs makes it essential more than ever to guarantee unimpeded assistance to humanitarian aid. And the shortcomings in the delivery of aid, particularly in the Northeast, are alarming. In this context, priority attention must be given to relaunching a credible political process. We call on the Special Envoy and encourage him to move forward on all the elements of Resolution 2254 in parallel to the work of the Constitutional Committee. I refer inter alia to the release of detainees, to the establishment of a safe and neutral environment, and preparing for elections in line with the provisions of Resolutions 2254 and under UN supervision, in order to give all Syrians their voice back, including those in the diaspora. We welcome the intention of the Special Envoy to take stock of the implementation of Resolution 2254. France is ready to contribute to that process. We repeat the following every month. Unless there's a credible political solution, France and its partners will not deviate from their positions on sanctions and reconstruction. It is a pragmatic position. There can be no stabilization of the situation in Syria without a political solution to the conflict. The convening of a conference on the return of refugees cannot change the reality, namely that conditions are not yet in place for the return of refugees and displaced persons. That is why France and its European partners refuse to participate in the conference. It is high time for all the members of this council to understand that no one can emerge victorious from the Syrian crisis through military means. In the face of this impasse, there is an urgent need to resume dialogue and for all parties to demonstrate a spirit of compromise. I call on Russia in particular to hear this message and to get the Syrian regime, which owes it its survival, to budge. Thank you.
I thank the representative of France for his statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Indonesia.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, my delegation would like to thank Deputy Special Envoy Matar, as well as Acting ASG and Deputy Emergency Relief Coordinator Raja Singham for their briefings on the political and humanitarian situation in Syria. We once again would like to express our appreciation to the United Nations and its humanitarian partners for continuing to provide life-saving assistances to the Syrian people despite challenging circumstances on the ground. Indonesia also commends Special Envoy Pedersen and his team's strong commitment to pursue peace in Syria. Madam President, I wish to highlight 3 points. First, the urgency to scale up humanitarian responses, particularly with the increasing cases of COVID-19 and the winterization. On top of the economic crisis and the threat of COVID-19 pandemic, the Syrian people must also deal with the harsh and challenging winter season. Many people in Syria are already displaced, with millions of families live in inadequate and crowded shelters. We can only imagine the hardships they are facing during winter in displacement. In addition, the winter rainfall has damaged the IDP sites across northwest Syria, which has worsened the already dire situation. It is therefore crucial to ensure the timely delivery of humanitarian assistances to civilians in need. In this context, my delegation believes that the combinations of cross-line and cross-border humanitarian access is important to guarantee that humanitarian assistance reaches people in need throughout Syria through the most direct routes and in accordance with the humanitarian principles of humanity, neutrality, impartiality, and independence. Second, we welcome the agreement by both co-chairs with regard to the next sessions of the Constitutional Committee. We are pleased to hear that the 4th session of the Constitutional Committee is scheduled to be held next Monday in Geneva and to be followed by the 5th session in January 2021. Indonesia sincerely hopes that all relevant parties will continue to engage in a constructive manner in order to achieve a substantive and concrete progress under the auspices of the United Nations in line with Resolution 2254 of 2015. This will be a significant step in ensuring the Syrian-led and Syrian-owned political process. It is also essential that all parties to the conflict and those with influence over them reach an inclusive agreement so as to resolve the conflict peacefully, as well as to avoid further suffering of the Syrian people. Third, and my last point, the imperative to protect civilians and to cease hostilities. We are particularly concerned about the intensifying hostilities in some areas in Syria. Indonesia urges all relevant parties to cease hostilities and to immediately comply with their obligations under international law, including international humanitarian law. Maintaining calm in Syria and respecting the ceasefire agreement are key. The Syrian people cannot afford any more tensions and conflict in this already very difficult situation. Military solution is not the answer to resolve the conflict in this country. Madam President, let me take this opportunity that my delegation wishes to express our condolences on the passing of the former Foreign Minister Walid al-Mualim. And to conclude, Madam President, I wish to emphasize the importance for this Council to unite around that common humanitarian goal to alleviate the suffering of the Syrian people and to support the mandate of the Special Envoy to assist the country achieve a comprehensive political settlement. I thank you very much, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Indonesia for his statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Vietnam.
Thank you, Madam President. At the outset, I would like to thank Deputy Special Envoy Pagala Mata and Assistant Secretary General Ramesh Singham for their informative briefing on the situation in Syria Arab Republic. I would like to welcome the representative of Syria, Turkey, and Iran to the meeting today. Madam President, first and foremost, on political fronts, my delegation welcomes the agreement of the concerned party on the agenda and the timeline for the upcoming meetings within the framework of the Constitutional Committee. We encourage the members of the committee to actively engage in constructive dialogue. Like other delegation, we look forward to the productive session to come in order to facilitate the broader political process in Syria. The only way toward achieving sustained peace and stability is through a political process which is led and owned by the Syrians themselves, facilitated by the United Nations, in line with Security Council Resolution 2254, fully adhere to the international law and the UN Charter, including the full respect of the sovereignty, territorial integrity, and non-interference in the internal affairs of Syria. Vietnam commends the effort of the special envoy teams in bringing parties together. We also welcome the current series of meetings between the special envoy and the international and regional interlocutors to discuss the advancement of the political solution in Syria. We continue to fully support the facilitating role of the United Nations as well as the viable diplomatic engagement in this regard. Madam President, while searching for a viable political solution, it is regrettable that the security and humanitarian situation on the ground remain a source of great concern, causing millions of Syrians to suffer. We are troubled by the fact that instability continues in certain parts of Syria, including the northwest. Even though the ceasefire agreement is generally held, it is seriously worrying to see the recent insurgence of terrorist activity in various areas of the country. My delegation condemns targeted attacks against civilian, humanitarian workers, and civilian objects. We urge all parties to exercise restraint, refrain from escalatory action, and continue their counter-terrorism efforts in line with obligations under international law, including humanitarian law. As reported by OCHA, the markedly worsening development of COVID-19 and impact on socio-economic downturn make the humanitarian situation in Syria overwhelmingly precarious. We noted that, according to OCHA, the area that had the most COVID-19 cases had the highest infection rate among health workers. The condition will subsequently be more and more critical in the months to come. We therefore urge all parties in Syria to create the most favorable condition to ensure timely, safe, and unimpeded humanitarian access, and to facilitate effective humanitarian operation in all parts of Syria. We reiterate our call on the international community to continue their support during this difficult time, with particular focus on tackling COVID-19 and its impact by providing adequate assistance in terms of equipment, capacity, as well as safety for health workers. Food security and utilization supports are of immediate necessity. At least over 2 million people do not have adequate shelter conditions. Millions of vulnerable people are living in IDP camps. The situation of food insecurity affecting more than half of the population, as well as increasing shortage of fuel and other basic goods, is far from being solved. In light of COVID-19 impact, it is relevant to make sure that sanctions do not undermine Syrian people's capacity to respond to the pandemic. Madam President, to conclude, we would like to take this opportunity to pay tribute to the humanitarian and healthcare workers on the ground, risking their lives to ensure that humanitarian assistance reaches people in need. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Vietnam for his statement. I give the floor to the representative of Estonia.
Thank you, Madam President. I thank the briefers for their overviews on the political situation and the many humanitarian challenges Syrians are facing before the upcoming winter. Looking at the political process, Estonia welcomes the announcement of holding the next round of Constitutional Committee talks at the end of this month in Geneva. Estonia calls the parties to engage actively in these discussions, as this fourth meeting is already long overdue. We are cautiously optimistic about the overall political process, as there is also a preliminary agreement for the fifth round in January. Committees meetings must become regular in order to build trust between the Syrian regime and its legitimate opposition. I reiterate Estonia's position that resolving the issue of detainees and missing persons is a cornerstone for national reconciliation and ending the conflict. More than 100,000 people remain detained or missing in Syria, largely at the hands of the Syrian regime. Release of arbitrarily detained people and identifying those who have lost their lives is at the core of resolutions 2254 and 2474. Madam President, Russia-Turkey ceasefire agreement from March seems to be holding. This truce provides local populations a break from violence, which is much needed in light of the growing numbers of COVID-19 infections around the country. However, instability prevails in many parts of Syria. Estonia condemns in strongest terms yesterday's bomb attacks near Al-Bab and Afrin, which wounded more than 40 people. We are also concerned that ISIL attacks are steadily increasing. Its propaganda continues, targeting vulnerable populations, including those living in overcrowded refugee camps. In this regard, OCHA's efforts in providing aid to millions of Syrians every month are crucial. Ahead of winter, preserving humanitarian access must be an imperative for the parties on the ground. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Estonia for his statement. I give the floor to the representative of Niger.
Je vous remercie, Madame.
At a time where, in other theaters, we're beginning to see very encouraging signs of progress towards ending crises through dialogue, the situation in Syria continues to be stuck and is a worrying one. The escalation of hostilities registered in recent weeks in the northwest of Syria has cost numerous people their lives, including children and humanitarian workers, as reported by UNICEF, and this remains a source of great concern. My delegation laments this renewed violence and calls on the parties to immediately cease hostilities, an essential precondition to making progress, tangible progress, towards resolving the crisis in Syria. The way out of this crisis, as we will never tire of repeating, must be sought on a political and not on a military basis through a Syrian-led process that includes the various components of Syrian society. That is why it is urgent to put the political process back on track in accordance with Resolution 2254. As Geir Pedersen has often mentioned, including last month, a political agreement to implement Resolution 2254 is indeed a means to restore the sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of Syria and to meet the legitimate aspirations of all Syrians. To that end, I call on the parties in the Syrian conflict to show greater restraint and make efforts to de-escalate hostilities. We also reiterate the appeals of the Secretary General and his special envoy for an immediate national ceasefire in Syria in order to create the right conditions for the success of the political process and mitigate the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, whose virulent spread in the country is alarming. Yet, and as my delegation has underscored on numerous occasions, these appeals, which we eagerly hope to hear echoed, should not detract us from combating terrorism. It is also crucial to prevent criminal groups from profiting on the current health crisis. Madam President, turning to the work of the Constitutional Committee, we're pleased to learn that if COVID-19 restrictions allow, the Special Envoy will organize the fourth round of consultations from November 30th to December 4th, 2020, and a fifth round in January 2021. In connection with this, my delegation calls for all stakeholders to show flexibility in order to move forward on the political front towards a lasting peace in Syria. Parties to the conflict must also take steps to strengthen mutual trust, in particular by commencing massive and unilateral releases of detainees and providing families of missing persons with information on their fate as trust-building measures requested by the Special Envoy. Madam President, Niger remains of the view that the political and humanitarian aspects of the crisis cannot be addressed separately, as the ongoing hostilities negatively impact the humanitarian situation, which in turn has an effect on the peace process. Indeed, the rate of infection of COVID-19 in Syria remains very worrying, given the weakened health infrastructure, the insecurity, living conditions, and a lack of access to adequate water and sanitation facilities, and particularly in the north, hinders the country's ability to respond effectively. A large number of vulnerable persons, including displaced persons and refugees, are highly exposed to the risk of contracting the virus. This is a major risk factor for an even larger crisis, as social distancing is virtually impossible in overcrowded camps. According to the detailed briefing of Mr. Rajasingham, it is clear that the humanitarian assistance provided to the Syrian population is falling short of meeting needs. A substantive improvement in the mechanism for delivering this aid is necessary across the entire territory of the country. Thus, procedures for the Bab al-Hawa checkpoint and between contact lines must be made more flexible and simplified in order to speed up the delivery of humanitarian aid, including medical supplies and equipment which the Syrian health system so direly needs in order to face the pandemic. In parallel, we call for an easing or suspension of unilateral economic sanctions, which could undermine Syria's ability to fight the pandemic. These sanctions serve to aggravate the situation, not only in Syria, but also for its neighbors. In conclusion, Madam President, I wish to express my delegation's gratitude to the Special Envoy and his team for their tireless efforts to engage in dialogue with all the parties to the process, including the Women's Advisory Board and civil society organizations in Syria and the region. Thank you for your attention.
by Damascus is acceptable. The Constitutional Committee must be able to convene in regular meetings that produce substantive outcomes. This simple demand is not putting in place artificial deadlines, as some member states insist. On the contrary, it is calling out the artificial delays fabricated by Syrian authorities. As my country has repeatedly underlined, the committee is Syria-owned, Syria-led, and facilitated by the UN. If we are to further regard the committee as a genuine door opener to the political process, it must deliver on its promises. Syria is currently incapable of carrying out elections in a free, fair, and transparent manner that would allow for the participation of the Syrian diaspora. Therefore, the Constitutional Committee needs to make progress, and quickly. Finally, Madam President, beyond the Constitutional Committee, tangible progress must be made on confidence-building measures, and specifically the urgent release of political prisoners and missing persons. Access to detainees must be granted in accordance with international regulations. Their legitimate property rights and administrative rights must be restored, in particular to women who have borne the brunt of this war. Justice must be done to victims. Belgium fully supports all accountability initiatives, including the IIIM, and we support the referral of the conflict in Syria to the International Criminal Court. I thank you for your attention.
I thank the representative of Belgium for his statement. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as the representative of St. Vincent and the Grenadines. I thank Acting Assistant Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Deputy Emergency Relief Coordinator, Mr. Rajasingham, as well as Deputy Special Envoy, Ms. Matar, for their briefings. A complex and inextricably linked relationship exists between Syria's humanitarian and political situations. The lack of progress on the political track gives rise to the further deterioration of the already dire humanitarian situation. This deterioration subsequently impedes efforts at attaining a political solution to the protracted conflict. As such, it is necessary to have a holistic and pragmatic approach. St. Vincent and the Grenadines reaffirms its support for the efforts of the Special Envoy and the work of the Constitutional Committee. We welcome the announcement of a fourth session of the small body of the committee at the end of November and encourage all members to participate in good faith for the benefit of all Syrians. The work of the committee remains a critical step in the wider political process. Addressing the outstanding issues of detainees and missing persons is also essential to the advancement of the wider process and will undoubtedly contribute to confidence building and reconciliation within Syria. We urge renewed and purposeful action in this regard. We take note of the International Conference on the Return of Syrian Refugees, which took place earlier this month in Damascus. We welcome and encourage constructive engagement and cooperation by key stakeholders and the wider international community in an effort to make meaningful progress on this critical issue. The creation of conditions necessary for the safe, voluntary, dignified, and well-informed return of refugees and internally displaced persons includes the reconstruction and rehabilitation of infrastructure indispensable to the survival of the civilian population. We yet again appeal to the international community to contribute to this effort. We are extremely concerned by reports of sporadic violence in the Northwest in violation of the March ceasefire agreement. All parties must exercise maximum restraint. Further, counterterrorism and other military activities must comply with international human rights law and international humanitarian law. And we remind all parties, as has been said many times over, that there is no military solution to the conflict. Serious socioeconomic deterioration persists and is made worse by the global pandemic. Food insecurity is a constant threat, and basic necessities remain out of reach. We are especially concerned for the millions of Syrians residing in various camps and other informal settlements that lack the means to implement necessary protective measures against COVID-19. we echo the call for the lifting of all unilateral coercive measures imposed on Syria to assist the country in meeting its pressing humanitarian needs, especially as winter approaches, and to allow it to successfully respond and emerge from the pandemic. We reiterate our steadfast support for the cross-border mechanism, which continues to be a lifeline for millions of Syrians. It is therefore imperative that cross-border and cross-line assistance be scaled up to meet the vast humanitarian needs in line with humanitarian principles. The only path out of the Syrian conflict is through a political process that puts the Syrian people at the forefront and demonstrates respect for the country's sovereignty, unity, and territorial integrity through the withdrawal of all unauthorized foreign forces and the consideration of the perspectives of all Syrians. After enduring the effects of a decade of war, the Syrian people deserve peace and stability. The international community must lend all necessary support towards the achievement of this goal. Before concluding, we wish to express our condolences to the Syrian Arab Republic on the passing of the Deputy Prime Minister and Foreign Minister, His Excellency Mr. Walid al-Mualem. We also congratulate His Excellency Dr. Bashar Jafari on his appointment as Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs. I thank you. I resume my function as President of the Council, and I now give the floor to the representative of the Syrian Arab Republic.
Thank you, Madam President. My delegation reiterates its thanks and appreciation for your successful and unique stewardship of the Security Council's work this month. I thank the Secretariat and the permanent representatives and members of the delegations who expressed their condolences on the passing of Mr. Walid al-Mualem, Deputy Prime Minister, Minister of Foreign Affairs and Expatriates. I would also like to thank you, Madam President, and all our dear colleagues who have expressed their congratulations to me on my appointment as a Minister of Foreign Affairs and Expatriates. Allow me to welcome the participation of Ms. Khawla Matar and Mr. Ramesh Rajansinghan. Madam President, over the past period since your last meeting on the political and humanitarian situation in my country, that session that was held on the October 27th, 2020, we have witnessed a number of important positive developments. Simultaneously, we have also witnessed from the US administration in particular and other hostile governments in general, witnessed more violations of international law, the principles and purposes of the United Nations and the relevant resolutions of your Council. Our meeting today have also witnessed some of these violations, which I will clarify in my statement today. Madam President, the International Conference on the Return of Syrian Displaced Persons and Refugees, which was held in Damascus on the 11th and 12th of November, represented a very significant step within the efforts of the Syrian state and its allies to ensure the safe, dignified, and voluntary return of the refugees to their areas of origin and places of residence, and to provide a suitable environment for that through cooperating with friendly countries and humanitarian partners to reconstruct what terrorism has destroyed and rehabilitate residential neighborhoods and public facilities, foremost among them are healthcare facilities, schools, power plants, and the economic, social, cultural, and service infrastructure. All of this was among the concerns expressed and demanded to be met in this hall over the years. But today we witness some who are putting preconditions to implement all these very important matters so that we can assist the people and government of Syria to face the burden of this terrorist war launched against it. The closing statement of the above-mentioned conference expressed the participants' firm adherence to the sovereignty and independence of the Syrian Arab Republic, also the adherence to its unity and territorial integrity. And these are principal pillars of the resolutions of the Security Council. This statement stressed the rejection of the coercive measures imposed on the Syrian people and demanded an end to the foreign occupation and its crimes, including the plundering of Syria's wealth and resources, as well as to continue combating terrorism and the terrorist organizations like ISIS and Jabhat al-Nusra and affiliated individuals and entities. All these matters are consistent with the positions of the United Nations and the resolutions of the Security Council and the General Assembly related to those core issues. In other words, we are not reinventing the wheel. This comes in total coherence with the matters agreed by the Security Council on the humanitarian and political fronts. The participants also affirmed their adherence to the political solution, a Syrian-owned and led solution with the facilitation of the United Nations. They stressed the need for the Constitutional Committee to carry its work in a consensual and constructive manner without external interference or attempts to impose artificial timelines in order to enable the committee to achieve the maximum support of the Syrian people for the outcomes of its work. They called on the international community to provide appropriate support, to provide a conducive environment to the return of the displaced and the return to normal life. This is consistent with Resolution 2254 and the mandate of the Special Envoy. For the third time, this is in total consistency with the terms of references of both the political and humanitarian files in the Security Council on Syria. Despite the fact that some people do not recognize that. However, in this context, my delegation would like to thank the Russian Federation and the governments of the countries that have genuinely participated in this conference, whether by attending personally or via video. Furthermore, we would like to thank those governments that boycotted the conference because they once again proved by their own actions the falsehood of what they claimed of human concern and a constructive role at the international level. These governments have also proven their desire to prolong the crisis and continue their geopolitical machination at the expense of the security and stability of my country and the well-being of its people. In the same context, my delegation regrets that the United Nations, the main humanitarian partner of the Syrian government, has yielded to the instructions of the former employee in the U.S. State Department, James Jeffrey, and breached its mandate and the requirements of its cooperation with the government of my country. Unfortunately, the UN system ended up simply assigning its resident coordinator to Syria to attend as an observer instead of engaging in dialogue and discussion as an active partner, supporting efforts aimed at improving the humanitarian situation and the dignified, safe, and voluntary return of the displaced and refugees in accordance with the international law. Madam President, the statements of some Western colleagues did not at all mention the need to combat terrorism in Syria in line with relevant Security Council resolutions. It is regrettable. Those statements were also void from any condemnation of the Israeli aggression that was repeated over the past 3 days twice. As if this matter has nothing to do with the political developments in Syria or providing a conducive environment, this escalation of aggression against Syria, while we in this council are now considering both the political and humanitarian dossiers. I have not listened to any condemnation of the Israeli aggression against my country. No, not a word was uttered on combating terrorism, which is a primary issue that necessitated that this august council adopt 10 resolutions on combating terrorism since the start of the Syrian crisis. You have adopted 10 resolutions to combat terrorism since the start of the Syrian crisis. Today, not a word on combating terrorism. Instead, we heard other weird statements from the Belgian-French colleagues and German, mainly that the European sanctions does not undermine human rights. I believe, and I think many of you believe, that this is not politically mature, neither legally. It is not mature under the halls of the Security Council, this legitimate place, since there is a subjective tendency in these words in violation of the resolutions of the United Nations, relevant resolutions that consider sanctions an illegitimate act. Are we dealing with one United Nations or a two-faced United Nations? We, as member states, consider that sanctions are illegitimate and illegal. How can some come to the Security Council and defend these sanctions, the European imposed sanctions, and describe them as not violating or not undermining human rights, as I heard? Some have used a surrealistic statement full of hallucinations on the situation in my country, as if there is a mandate that takes us back to the eras prior to the establishment of the United Nations. Of course, it's a European language known to all. However, this guardianship language surpasses diplomacy. It has nothing to do with the facts on the ground or the developments on the ground. Madam President, it is regrettable that at a time when the United Nations was forced not to send its representatives to participate in the International Conference on the Return of Syrian Refugees, a UN delegation, including the so-called Mark Keats, who is known as the Deputy Regional Coordinator for Human Affairs, he sneaked illegally and without the consent of the Syrian government across into the Idlib Governorate in northwestern Syria, across our borders with Turkey. That Keats was accompanied by a number of the so-called security men affiliated with Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, Jabhat al-Nusra, that terrorist organization which is designated on the Security Council's list as the Syrian arm of al-Qaeda. Imagine this surrealistic scene. Is this the practical application of the United Nations role as an effective partner of the Syrian government in the humanitarian field? Is this irresponsible, provocative, cheap act response to the role of the United Nations as an effective partner of the Syrian government? I beg that question and leave it up to you to answer. This condemned behavior is a violation of my country's sovereignty. It's a violation of the existing cooperation between the Syrian government and Acha. It supports terrorism. It's a violation of your Council's resolutions on combating terrorism and the principles of the humanitarian action included in General Assembly Resolution 46/182. We look forward to His Excellency, the Secretary General and his Undersecretary for Humanitarian Affairs to take the necessary measures to ensure an apology to the government of Syria and to hold the perpetrators accountable for this violation. Those who deal with a terrorist organization must be held accountable, no matter who he is. Madam President, my country condemns in the strongest terms the visit of U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo to the Israeli settlements in the occupied Syrian Golan and the West Bank in Palestine on November the 19th. This visit represents an expression of the current U.S. administration's keenness until the last moments of its tenure to affirm its bias and absolute loyalty to Israel at the expense of the principles of international law and the provisions of the Charter, as well as relevant United Nations resolutions, including Security Council Resolution 497 of 1981 and the security and stability of our region. Pompeo's visit also represents an encouragement for the Israeli occupation authorities to continue their aggressive acts, the last of which was the aggressions launched against my country on November the 18th and last night. We assure you and assure Pompeo that this visit will not change the legal, political, or geographical status of the Golan as an occupied territory and an integral part of Syria. We will exert all efforts and rely on all means provided by international law to restore that land. On another note, Madam President, the American occupation and its tools of separatist Kurdish militias continue their practices aimed at plundering the resources of the Syrian state. In conjunction with their overt theft of Syrian oil and gas, which we shared with you in many of our official statements and letters, the U.S. occupation forces have recently excavated and explored antiquities in Hasaka Governorate in northeastern Syria. They had unearthed a lot of antiquities, archaeological sites, and gold in the presence of French and Israeli archaeologists. This reminds us of what they have done in Iraq, of course. The American occupation forces also excavated an archaeological site in the countryside of Al-Malikiya in Al-Hasaka Governorate, where they found 12 graves and historical monuments dating back to the Roman era. These looted Syrian antiquities, which are priceless and date back thousands of years, are being smuggled through Iraqi Kurdistan and Turkey in preparation for their transfer to other destinations, including the capitals of some of your countries. These described crimes are an extension of the crimes that ISIS, this terrorist organization, has consistently committed to provide financial resources for its terrorist activities and to enhance its geographical scope of the alleged caliphate. The principle has replaced the agent today in a clear exchange of roles. Not only that, but the American occupation forces continue their efforts to grant kind of a legitimacy to the terrorist organizations and their agent militias, as well as the artificial entities associated with them. Lately, an American delegation of the so-called Religious Freedom Commission illegally infiltrated into the countryside of the Syrian governorate of Deir ez-Zor and the Tabqa area in the Raqqa governorate. The delegation held meetings with representatives of those militias and their affiliated entities. Moreover, the American Creative International Associates company also concluded agreements with the Civil Council in Deir ez-Zor. And the question is this how the host country of the United Nations headquarters defend the provisions of the Charter and the principles of international law? This is the language we know best in the Security Council. We use the provisions of international law and the Charter, and as is stated in English, we go by the book. Madam President, and As you all know, the Turkish regime and its terrorist organizations and mercenaries systematically use drinking water as a weapon against civilians by cutting off the water supply from a Luk water station for about 1 million Syrians living in the city of Hasaka and its vicinity. To add insult to injury, the Turkish regime and its tools stole the water pumps belonging to the wells of Asfar Najar and Ain al-Kibrit and Majra al-Kabur, located in the city of Ras al-Ain in Hasaka Governorate in northern Syria. This represents the persistence of the Erdogan regime in committing war crimes and crimes against humanity in my country, while enjoying the impunity provided by its allies in NATO. Furthermore, the mercenaries of the Turkish regime and the so-called Sultan Murad and Sultan Suleiman Shah terrorist factions carried out digging and excavation work in several archaeological areas in Afrin and its vicinity to steal antiquities and smuggle them to Turkey. The Turkish regime was not satisfied with that, but rather stole large quantities of wheat, barley, and other agricultural crops and smuggled them to Turkey, similar to the previous looted oil, antiquities, factories, machinery, and property, and burned what it was not able to steal. In addition, the Turkish regime stole the olive crop, the Syrian olive crop, and sold the Syrian olive oil to the American and European markets as a Turkish product. Despite all of these facts, some come to lecture us about the implementation of Resolution 2254. And I invite you to start with the first sentence of that resolution, which affirms the strong commitment of the Security Council to the sovereignty, unity, and territorial integrity of the Syrian Arab Republic. Are you ready to demonstrate your implementation of that important paragraph in Resolution 2254? Will the other stakeholders cooperate with the Secretary General and his special envoy in the implementation of this commitment? Then what about the implementation of Resolution 2253 that was adopted just one day before the adoption of Resolution 2254? Ladies and gentlemen, Resolution 2254 includes more than 22,650 words. The speaker corrects himself, 2,650 words. Resolution 2254 must be respected holistically. We should not be selective in using one paragraph or the other. We have to respect the entire resolution or state that this resolution is not to be implemented or not applicable. There is no proportionality in handling this resolution. We have to start by implementing the very first paragraph of that resolution. We have to strongly commit to the sovereignty, unity, and territorial integrity of the Syrian Arab Republic. That's how Resolution 2254 starts. Madam President, the fourth round of meetings of the Constitutional Committee will take place in a few days. And in this vein, my delegation reaffirms the Syrian ownership and leadership of the political process facilitated by the United Nations. We stress that the success of the work of this committee requires respecting the rules of its procedures that have been agreed upon and rejecting any external interference in its work or any attempt by some governments to impose artificial timetables. The Constitutional Committee is its own master, and the Syrian people alone have the exclusive right to make their own future. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of the Syrian Arab statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the Islamic Republic of Iran.
Thank you, Madam President.
I'm sorry, there is an open mic. It might be briefer 3, Syrian Arab Republic.
Madam President, after almost 10 years of conflict, the Syrian people continue to suffer from aggression, foreign occupation, and terrorism. Through unlawful occupation, inhumane sanctions, politicizing the return of refugees and IDPs, and preventing international support for Syria's reconstruction, certain countries are responsible for the prolongation of the conflict as they attempt to impose their own will on the Syrian people. Such attempts are unlawful and immoral and doomed to fail. Syrian crisis can only be settled through political means, and the right to determine the future of Syria belongs exclusively to Syrians, and the international community should assist them to realize this right. It means sovereignty, political independence, unity, and territorial integrity of Syria must be fully respected by all. Any separatist agenda, as well as illegitimate self-rule initiatives, must be rejected, and all foreign forces whose presence is not permitted by the Syrian government must leave Syria. In this context, the full, immediate, and unconditional withdrawal of the US forces from Syria is essential. Instead of combating terrorism, they continue supporting UN-designated terrorist groups such as Al-Nusra Front, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, as well as looting the oil and the wealth of the Syrian people. Combating terrorists in Syria must be continued until the full removal of their threats. Obviously, this must be done with the utmost care for the lives of civilians. Terrorists must not be allowed to continue taking a large number of civilians as hostages and to turn places like Idlib into their safe haven. We strongly condemn Israel's continued aggression against Syria's sovereignty. The occupation of the Syrian Golan by Israel is unlawful, and the recognition of its annexation to Israel by the United States is null and void. The recent provocative visit to the Syrian Golan of the US Secretary of State was designed to legitimize the annexation. Golan is and will remain a part and parcel of the Syrian territory. Underlying the importance of a Syrian-led, Syrian-owned, and UN-facilitated political process, we continue to support the efforts of the United Nations and the SRSG Pedersen for political settlement of the Syrian crisis. Iran will spare no efforts to that end. In this context, useful consultations, including on the work of the Constitutional Committee, took place during the recent visit of Mr. Pedersen to Tehran, where he met with our foreign minister and other high-ranking officials. Supporting the Constitutional Committee, which must operate without any external interference or pressure, or setting any artificial deadline to conclude its work, we are hopeful that the true interests of the Syrian people will prevail over all interests. Parallel to political process, international efforts must continue to facilitate Syria's reconstruction and the safe and voluntary return of refugees and IDPs to their original places of residence in Syria. As an important effort in this regard, we welcome the International Conference on the Return of the Syrian Refugees held on 11 and 12 November in Damascus, which has unfortunately been boycotted by some countries who politicize almost every issue related to ending the conflict, return of refugees, and Syria's reconstruction. The interests of millions of Syrian refugees must not be held hostage for political gains by certain powers. While the Syrian people are facing challenges of conflict and the COVID-19 pandemic, avoiding to assist the return of refugees will only increase and prolong their sufferings, which has already been deteriorated due to the imposition of inhumane unilateral sanctions by the United States. The international community should not leave the Syrian people alone in their struggle to overcome the threats of terrorism and foreign aggression and occupation, as well as economic terrorism resulting from these unlawful sanctions. Finally, I would like to express our condolences to the Syrian people on the passing of late Walid al-Muallim, the former foreign minister of Syria. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of the Islamic Republic of Iran for his statement. I give the floor to the representative of Turkey.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, I would like to thank Deputy Special Envoy Pavla Matar and Acting ASG for Humanitarian Affairs, Raja Singham, for their briefings. People in Syria are trapped in an endless war. They are subject to widespread crimes against humanity at the hands of Assad's ruthless regime. They are striving to survive in lamentable conditions. The situation at our doorstep in northwest Syria is further alarming with the sharp rise in the COVID-19 cases. 1.5 million out of 4 million Syrians in this region live in hundreds of overcrowded IDP camps, and they are directly exposed to COVID-19 without any means of prevention and isolation. Hospitals and health facilities are struggling. Since the last Security Council meeting on Syria, the percentage of healthcare workers among current cases increased to 15. Half of the healthcare workers infected throughout Syria are in the northwest. We have mobilized all our resources in order to minimize the impact of COVID-19 on vulnerable groups, especially women and children. In accordance with the recent trilateral agreement on the fight against COVID-19, Turkish Red Crescent, OCHA, and WHO started to deliver health aid. People by meeting their operation. With limited cross-border operations, the UN makes enormous efforts every month to reach 1.3 million people in northern Aleppo who were previously served via Bab el-Salam crossing point. Since the adoption of the resolution 2533 last July, around 2,500 trucks crossed into the northwest through Bab el-Hawa. This figure corresponds only to half of the volume channeled through our crossing points within the same time frame prior to the resolution 2533. If the Council fails to reauthorize Bab el-Salam crossing point, it will condone further deterioration of the humanitarian situation. This might have security repercussions for the whole region and beyond. Madam President, preserving the ceasefire in Idlib is a sine qua non for the protection of millions of vulnerable civilians living under dire conditions. Turkey remains fully committed to ensuring a lasting ceasefire in Idlib. We continue to engage with Russia in technical talks and in joint efforts towards the full implementation of the additional protocol. Unfortunately, there is a worrying increase in ceasefire violations targeting civilians and moderate opposition groups in the Idlib de-escalation area. These attacks risk triggering a new humanitarian crisis and provide a pretext for terrorist organizations to exploit the situation. All ceasefire violations in contravention of the additional protocol and existing agreements must be stopped. Madam President, while we make all the efforts to alleviate the human suffering and take all the necessary measures to preserve the ceasefire in Idlib, we also continue to contribute to advancing the political process in line with Resolution 2254. Turkey, in her capacity as an Astana guarantor, played a leading role in the establishment of the Constitutional Committee. Currently, this committee is the sole functioning mechanism within the political process. We wholeheartedly support Special Envoy Pedersen's efforts to facilitate the committee's work in a systematic manner. We reiterated our strong support to his facilitation role during his visit to Ankara on 2nd and 3rd November. We welcome the announcement that the next two rounds of the Constitutional Committee will be held during the course of next week and in January 2021, respectively. We believe that it is crucial to accelerate the work of the committee through regular meetings. Next rounds should focus on the substance, and the constitutional process should, in due course, yield results that address the legitimate aspirations of Syrian people. Syrians should not wait another decade to meet their expectations. Madam President, Advancing the work of the committee and the political process in general will contribute to the common goal of creating a conducive environment for voluntary, safe, and dignified return of Syrians. With 4 million Syrians living in Turkey and 5 million under our care and protection in Syria, we are aware of the demands and expectations of the Syrian people from the international community. It is a shame that the Assad regime is organizing meetings under the pretext of discussing the return of refugees. These are attempts by this murderous regime to add insult to injury. Madam President, through mechanisms in place with UNHCR, but also with neighboring countries, we have been discussing the issue of returns in full compliance with the UN criteria. We are ready to support any initiative reflecting the UN parameters on this matter, with agreed modalities and scope. We will continue to oppose any initiatives attempting to support the regime's agenda and support its unlawful actions. Madam President, let me briefly touch upon the situation in the Al-Hol camp, which has increasingly become a source of concern. Over 63,000 people, 94% of whom are women and children, live in an extremely miserable condition in the camp, where security incidents and reports of deaths continue to be recorded. Family reunification and repatriation remain crucial for long-term solutions to this lasting problem. In this part of Syria, actions of the terrorist organization PKK-YPG threatening the territorial integrity of Syria have been steadily increasing. Yesterday's bomb attacks carried out by PKK-YPG in Afrin and Al-Bab, resulting in scores of civilian casualties, are latest testaments of the total disregard of this terrorist organization for the human life. PKK-YPG continues to release Daesh detainees en masse through so-called amnesties when it serves its interests. It is reported that in the last 2 months alone, PKK-YPG released over 1,000 Daesh members. In the face of such brazen acts, it truly defies logic when some member states still insist on portraying PKK-YPG as a reliable partner in the fight against terrorism. How can anyone in their right mind trust a terrorist group to combat another? How many more Daesh members need to be arbitrarily released by PKK-YPG before the international community reacts? International community can no longer remain silent to these terrorist acts, infiltrations, and harassments. Turkey will certainly not remain idle. We will not hesitate, taking necessary steps to safeguard our national security and ensure that peace and stability prevail. Madam President, to conclude, let us remember how we reached this point. The regime, instead of meeting the legitimate aspirations of the Syrian people, has employed all instruments of violence in its disposal to prolong its grip to power. The people of Syria have been punished brutally, including by chemical weapons, bio bombs, demographic change, sexual violence, arbitrary detentions, torture, starvation, and sieges. These are facts. They are all well documented. We all know the blunt reality. The persistent lies of the regime do not change that. Madam President, as to the delusional remarks of the regime representative, I just would like to emphasize that I do not consider him as my legitimate counterpart. His mere presence here is an affront to the millions of Syrians who suffered countless crimes at the hand of this regime. Therefore, I will not honor him with a response. Thank you, Madam Chairman.
I thank the representative of Turkey for his statement. Before adjourning this meeting, as this is the last scheduled open meeting of the Council for the month of November, I would like to express the sincere appreciation of the delegation of St. Vincent.
I apologize for interrupting. I see the representative of the Syrian Arab Republic having raised his hand. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hasmik, and apologies for not seeing you when you raise your hand, Excellency. I now give the floor to the representative of the Syrian Arab Republic. We are not hearing you.
Mr. Ambassador, we do not. Mr. Ambassador, your mic is muted, I believe. Your mic is still muted. Mr. Ambassador, your mic is muted. Your screen will need to be refreshed. Madam President, I do not know if you wish to proceed with the conclusion or wait for the representative of the Syrian Arab Republic to rejoin.
I would give it another minute. I would give it another minute, and if he doesn't rejoin, then I'll proceed. And if he comes back, then he can have the floor. Thank you.
Madam Chair, if I may, while fully respecting your position, I feel that the Syrian ambassador has taken up quite a bit of our time already this afternoon, and perhaps if he has further things to add, he might wish to just write to the Council with his concluding thoughts. It's now after 1 o'clock. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. I still want to just give him another minute. If he doesn't join within the next 1 or 2 minutes, then we will conclude and we can have his written comments following that. Thank you.
Madam President, the representative of Germany has raised his hand, has asked for the floor.
Yes, go ahead, Ambassador.
Madam President, given that under these circumstances we have another 30 seconds, I would like to use those to congratulate on the excellent work that St. Vincent and the Grenadines have done over this last month. Congratulations, great job, and thank you very much for that.
Thank you, Ambassador, for those kind words. Much, much appreciated.
Madam President, do you hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you. You have the floor, Ambassador. Yes, I can hear you. You have the floor, Ambassador.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Sorry for the inconvenience. Madam President, أنا أعتذر عن طلب.
I apologize for taking the floor once again, Madam President, and I don't usually comment on what my colleague, the Turkish ambassador, usually says. However, today, the words that he spoke were misleading. And I would like to remind you of a few points. That a few of the actions of the Turkish regime since the beginning of the crisis. These are very important milestones that are sponsors of terrorism in my country. Since the beginning of the Syrian crisis, the Turkish borders with my country were left wide open to tens of thousands of terrorists from all over the world. You all may recall that some foreign ministers of some permanent member states in the Security Council were describing these terrorists as jihadis. Rather, some of those foreign ministers and heads of government and heads of republics were calling these terrorists, these foreign terrorists, who entered my country through Turkey. They called them the moderate Syrian opposition. These thousands of terrorists, these hordes of terrorists were being funded by Qatar and Saudi Arabia. The Turkish regime was in charge of transporting these hordes to our borders with them, where they were trained, and then they were allowed entry into Syria. The first such experience of the use of chemical gas was perpetrated by the Turkish side. It was perpetrated by Jabhat al-Nusra inside Turkish territories openly, and the web link was promulgated in the social networking sites, and you can see audio and video evidence of who was experimenting with the use of chemical weapons on rabbits. There's a voice on the link that says, we have successfully used chemical weapons on rabbits, and now we will start using them inside Syria. This is recorded. This is well known. The Turkish regime is guilty of shedding Syrian blood in all forms since the beginning, allowing entry to the terrorists, encouraging terrorists to use chemical weapons. And we had sent you a special letter on a Syrian terrorist called Haytham al-Kassab, who transported 2 liters of sarin from inside Libya to Istanbul on board a civilian aircraft, and transported these 2 liters of sarin carried by that terrorist to the Syrian borders, where they crossed into Syria. Naturally, these chemical materials were used in the Syrian village of Khan al-Asal in March 2013. This led to the martyrdom of 23 Syrian soldiers and civilians. We've told you about this. Nobody lifted a finger. Not the Council, and not its subcommittees that are concerned with combating terrorism. These are facts that the Turkish regime cannot deny. Even this flimsy objection, this flimsy opposition that lacks a national spirit, most of it lives in Turkey. It's supported by the Turkish regime. They mainly live in Istanbul. I would like to remind you of something else. The former Qatari Prime Minister, Hamad bin Jassim, admitted at France 24, channel France 24, and on BBC Arabic, and on the official Qatari television channel, this man made an important statement where he said that Washington had asked Qatar to lead the process of sponsoring terrorism in Syria. There is a U.S. mandate given to Qatar. Washington asked Sheikh Hamad to go to Riyadh to coordinate with the Saudis over who will be leading this operation against Syria. And the Syrian king at the time, the former king, the Saudi king at the time, I beg your pardon, said to Hamad, go ahead with God's blessings. Let Qatar lead the operation and we'll support you. All of this happened with Washington's knowledge. Then Hamad said, Qatar alone spent $137 billion to undermine the stability of my country, Syria. Is this a cartoon, or are these facts that must be taken into consideration in the Security Council? Is this some kind of comedy? Who will be held responsible for the blood of hundreds of thousands of Syrians that was shed? The Turkish regime representative comes here and starts claiming and singing the praises of purity and chastity, while we know what the regime is doing in Azerbaijan, Qatar, and Libya, and in the Eastern Mediterranean. Though those who are closest to Turkey now include some of the Europeans. And I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of the Syrian Arab Republic for his further remarks. And I would like to continue with my thank yous on behalf of St. Vincent and the Grenadines. As you know, this is our last meeting, like I said before, and we really, truly wish to express heartfelt and sincere appreciation on behalf of St. Vincent and the Grenadines to the members of the Council and to the Secretariat for all the support that we have been given, as well as the encouragement and very kind words. Indeed, it has been a busy month and one in which we rallied to consensus on several important issues within our purview. We could not have done it alone and without the hard work and support and positive contributions of every delegation and the representatives of the Secretariat, including the technical support team, conference services, officers, interpreters, verbatim reporters, and security staff. As we end our presidency, I know I speak on behalf of the Council in wishing the delegation of South Africa good luck in the month of December. And with that, I would like to say that this concludes our live broadcast, the live broadcast of this meeting, wishing all a very prosperous and healthy holiday weekend. Take care and thank you.